Super, let's get started. So firstly then, just want to think about what is a budget? And obviously in this scenario, why is it important? So very simply, a budget is a financial plan for a specific period of time, usually a year. And obviously in this scenario, yes, we are working for the 1st of April to the 31st of March. Predominantly then we're thinking about this process because we need to do it. We need to set the precept. So yes, it allows the councils to set an appropriate precept amount and plan for future projects. But also I want sort of an underlying theme of today is not just about at this time of the year, we do a budget in order to set the precept and then we move on. We want to think about the budget all year through. Hopefully, on your monthly meetings, you're looking at the budget versus actuals, thinking about what's going on. Because understanding that budget, looking at that budget all the year through will obviously make it that much easier. You'll have a better understanding of it. So when it comes to this time of the year, you'll already sort of have a good feeling for what's going on. So that theme really is the importance of the budget all the year through. It's because monitoring that budget versus actuals can help identify potential under overspend, allow for corrective action. So not just the precept setting, as we said, but thinking about actually what's going on in this financial year as well. If something's potentially going wrong, we can look at that and hopefully stop that issue before we get too far in and it's a real problem. And as I've put there as well, all members of the council shall understand the budget. So not necessarily to the nth degree, but the importance of it and understanding that there is a budget that we're working to, because too many times I hear that councillors look at the money in the bank, they see the bank rec, look at the bottom line, think there's loads of money and want to spend it. But actually, we've got a budget we're working to. Money might be in reserves and money might be in reserves. So having that understanding of that's there to sort of guide what we're trying to do is really, really important as well. So obviously we've got financial regulations, so it's very likely that you've got something in yours along the lines of this, which is before setting a precept, the council must calculate its council tax requirement for each financial year by preparing and approving a budget in accordance with the Local Government Finance Act 1992. So just to really sort of reiterate that we have to do this, it's in law, it's there. So parish councils, regardless of their size, have a statutory duty to prepare that annual budget. So likely why you're here, because obviously it needs to be done and it needs to be prepared and approved before. So the budget needs to be prepared and approved before we can set the precept, and obviously as well before the start of the financial year, and obviously also in line with submitting it to the deadline for your precepting authority. But different areas do seem to have different deadlines. So in terms of that sort of deadline timetable, this is kind of just a rough thought process of where you're likely to be working through, but obviously it would depend on the deadlines that you're working to and also the council meetings that you'll have in place for reviewing and approving the budget and the precept as a result of that. So October, so now we're going to be starting thinking about it, working on the draft budgets. If you've got different departments and committees, making sure that they're doing their parts of that budget so that you can pull it together. And then November, roughly, we're going to be thinking about producing a full draft budget. So hopefully you have got your timetable in place, your meetings in the diary of when these things are going to happen, so you can work back, give deadlines. If you have got other people involved in the process, make sure you're clear with them when you need information by, so you can pull it together. And as we sort of mentioned at the beginning, this is really important. This is a really key part of the financial year. So ensuring that you have got specific time allocated to do this is really, really key. Okay, it's not something that you can just knock up at the end of the day, 10 minutes spare, do this. This is really important. So likely then that you'll be having meetings in December to present the budget. At full council meetings, you might have had some reviews of that budget before or at the meeting, obviously to go through those processes, review what's going on. And then it's likely, most of the time it seems to be the end of January is the deadline for your precepting authority, but obviously make sure you know when you've got to get that in for them to work as well. But really, we're in the thick of it at the moment. So next, I just want to talk about a couple of budgeting approaches. So when we're thinking about the process that we're going to go through in order to set the budget, how we might then deal with that, how we might actually approach that process. So firstly, we've got incremental budgeting. So that, as it says there, traditional method of budgeting and based on the current year and or historic data. So if you have a good budget in place, the structure is good, you know, the way it's sectioned up and the budget lines are appropriate, and you're able to analyze what's going on, and you can look at certain departments or areas, or you can see how well the village hall is performing, all of those things. And if the numbers in the budgets are appropriate and you're able to analyze things, you know, correctly and with good, useful information, there is no point reinventing the wheel and starting again. That is a good basis to work from. And that's what definitely I'll be suggesting that you do. The intention of incremental budgeting, though, is to add on a percentage or an incremental amount. So as it says at the bottom there, it doesn't necessarily encourage an in-depth analysis of the current budget, because you could simply take the budget you've got, go, right, we're back on 5%, we're done. And actually did this session last month, and there was a lady on there said that was the intention of their councillors, that they were just going to take the budget and put 5% on. So I'd really strongly advise not to do that, and at least to look at it budget line per section, to consider, you know, each of those lines, each of those parts of the budget. It might be that at the end of that process, the overall percentage increment that you're using is around 5%, but you want to think about it line by line, section per section, because some of them might need a greater increase, some of them might need a lesser increase. And if you just put a blanket total on, you then in time, that budget is going to become less and less meaningful. So this is a good starting point, but let's be a bit more detailed about our approach to it. Okay, so the other part of that, so the other end of the spectrum here, is zero-based budgeting. So the idea behind that is that you start from scratch. You don't look at anything that's gone before, not the current year, not any prior years, completely start again. So if you are in a situation where the things I just mentioned with regards to the budget, so the structure is not good. So if you're actually looking at that thinking, I'm really struggling to analyse exactly what's going on, maybe we don't have enough budget lines, maybe it's all grouped in and I can't really see exactly what's going on, or maybe we've got loads and loads of budget lines and it's really spread out and it's just really hard to sort of see, and it's great long pages of paper that just doesn't mean anything. Or maybe the budget amounts that we've got against these lines actually don't really line up with them or how we're looking the actuals. There's a disparity between the two, and it becomes meaningless. We can't really analyse what's going on. We can't really see where we're going with it. Maybe it is time to start again. And the intention there, blank piece of paper, build it back up again. So it does therefore allow for a full analysis of all the budget elements. So obviously you've got to be really careful to make sure you don't forget everything, because if you're starting from scratch, it's thinking about everything that you need and analysing all of that. So there's a lot of work involved in that, but sometimes it comes to a point to say, actually, what we've got at the moment just isn't working. And it might be that maybe it's not the whole budget, maybe it's a certain section of it, or maybe it's a consideration to take it a little bit further to say, right, we need to look at these budget lines because they're just not appropriate. And as it says at the bottom there, it may also be useful for one-off or special projects. So particularly if you're planning things from reserve, you're doing sort of a special project, it's likely that when you're thinking about how much that's going to cost, naturally, it's going to be zero-based budgeting because it's going to be something that hasn't happened previously, and you're going to have to think about all the cost elements involved within it. So just wanted to kind of go through those two options, really, just to think about how that might then play out when we go through this process a little bit further on that we talk about. So next then is forecasting. So forecasting is really, really useful because, as we talked about when we thought about the deadlines, is that obviously we need to set a budget for next year, starting the 1st of April. We have to get that budget and the Precept request. Therefore, we need to approve the budget, send in the Precept request probably by the end of January. But really what we'd like to know is, how is this financial year going to play out? Where are we going to be at the 31st of March? How is it going to look? And that's going to help me then think about what's happened with this year's budget, and then we can think about next year's. Obviously, we can't wait for that point because we need to do these things before we get to the 31st of March. So the next best thing if we haven't got our crystal ball to hand, is to forecast, to predict the future income and expenditure, create a expected financial year position. So we can go through the months that haven't yet taken place, anticipate, so forecast what we think is going to happen in those months in terms of spend and income, and then that will give us an expected end of year position. So predominantly, we're thinking about this to help us with budgeting, because we can then see how it's going to look in this current financial year. But actually, it's really useful going forward as well, because we can keep using it in this financial year, because we can understand how our spending is going to look. Are there any sort of budget lines of concern? Does it look like we've got any areas that are going to be overspent based on what we think is going to happen? So we can then use that forecast with our other information that we've got to hand. And then that really is useful in terms of looking ahead to next year's budget. I've put in there actually using conjunction other data, especially if the current year is non-typical. So that originally was put in to the slides when we first did this back in COVID lockdown. And obviously we ended up with a year that wasn't untypical. It's really hard to work out what's going on because everything shut down, and what we thought was going to happen didn't necessarily. So most of the time, things are hopefully a little bit more structured, a little bit more sort of standard as you might expect them to be. So you can use what is happening in this year as a basis for what we think then we will need for next year. But obviously, if you've got any sort of thing going on specifically at your council that mean things are going to change significantly, or things that are happening at the moment are non-typical, obviously you'll need to take that into consideration. And when we did Scribe Fest a couple of weeks ago, we had quite a lot about devolution, reorganisation of services. So that's something obviously to consider if you're in a council where you might be taking on some additional services or responsibility for some assets. Obviously, you're going to need to build those elements in as well, and consider how they're going to be funded and how that's going to build into the budget, if that's something that obviously hasn't been before. So thinking about forecasting then, thinking about how useful it can be, let's think about how we actually then go through that process to do it. So there we've got the half year point, April to September is a good place to start, but you can do it from any month end. So we're in sort of end of October now. So we will have a 6th month actual position. April to September has happened, and hopefully we've got all that data in. We've got it reconciled. So now we can forecast, anticipate what we think is going to happen for October to March to give us our full financial year forecast. So we're simply predicting the remaining months' income and expenditure per budget line. So I said simply, and some of that won't be simple because it's hard to obviously know everything that we expect is going to happen. And as I've said there, some budget lines will be easier to forecast than others. And that is naturally the sort of similar scenarios when you're actually budgeting. Some lines are going to be fairly straightforward to deal with, others less so. But the important thing to do when you're forecasting is to be realistic. So if you know that you're going to end up with an overspent budget line because something's going to happen or the spend is more than you anticipated, you need to put it into the forecast. Don't be scared of making it look nice. Be making sure that you actually put in what you expect to happen, because then that's going to flag up at the end of the financial year if you've got a position that is a budget line that's overspent. Obviously, next year we can think about what do we need to do? You know, was it a one-off situation that won't be repeated, or do we need to rethink this budget line because it's not enough for what's happening? And then once we've got that, obviously we can then analyse it against the budget, start trends and patterns of variances, and then think about what we therefore need to do with regards to next year and the budget lines we've got there. So this is an extract from a spreadsheet I created back when I first started with Scribe, because Scribe didn't originally, when I was first there, have a forecasting function. We do now, but we created the spreadsheet that lots of people have used. But the principle is basically that you're going to have your actuals and then you can forecast. So in this very simple example, you can see I've got my sections on the left-hand side and my budget lines and my codes. Within those sections of admin, grounds, maintenance and allotments. I've got my total annual budget for the current financial year, and I've got my April to September total actual, so my 6th monthly position in actuals, obviously they've happened. And then I'm forecasting. So I'm putting in what I'm expecting to spend from October to March in those columns there. And then I've got a total. So that total column is what I expect, where I expect to be at the end of the financial year. And then I've got a variance. So if it happens as I expect, that will be my variance to the budget. And then I can think about what my proposed budget will be based on where that looks. You know, if my budget wasn't enough, do I need to increase it? If it was led, what needs to happen? So I've got that to look at, to sort of review and work from. I've then got that column for my proposed budget. So based on what's happened or things that I might know already, I can then start to put a proposed budget together. And I've got some comments in there as well. So comments and notes, I would say, is another theme of this. Really, really important. You know, keep records of things that you know are going to change or you need to consider. And then when you're going through that budget setting process, if things are changing or a budget line is made up of a number of factors, make sure you document it, because the last thing you want is to get to April, first budget meeting for the new budget, and all the questions of why is this budget this figure and what's gone on here and what does that involve. We want to sort of diminish those sort of questions. We want to analyse what's happening, not where the budget came from, because we've all forgotten what we agreed when we did this in December. So do keep records and notes as well, because that's really, really useful to tie up with what you've agreed and what you've done. So that's that one then. So that's quite sort of useful principle of what you're going to do. If you've got software, very likely that it will do, if it's sector specific, that you can forecast within it. That's just a simple extract from Scribe, just for sort of admin, as you can see. And I've put, by telling it some forecasting types against my codes, it puts some numbers in some boxes for me. And as we talked about, once you've created that forecast, it's then useful to keep it going. You know, you predominantly might start to use it initially in order to look at the budget, set the precept. But actually for the remainder of the financial year, you might want to keep it going, because then it will give you a feel of what's happening and where you're likely to end up as well. Okay, so now we've thought about that, we can think about the budget process. So this is now sort of bringing everything we've got together and starting to work through the elements of actually setting and thinking about what our budget wants or needs to be. So use the current year forecast and any other relevant data. So this is where we're pulling together what we may know. We may have some things where we know the renewal price or or that we've got an agreed contract in place. So we know some elements. We may know some things are changing. We've got our forecast to base things upon as well. So we're pulling that information together. And we need to consider expenditure. So obviously that's a big element of our budget. So best to start with expenditure. We need to give some consideration to income, so any other sources of income that we receive, not the precept. And we also need to think about our contingencies and our reserves, so making sure we've got an appropriate level of reserves, and if we've got some projects and other things in place, are we able to plan for them appropriately as well? And while we're going through this process, we're going to be mindful of our level of detail. So as we talked about, we want to think about it per budget line, not just add on generic 5% and go for it. We're going to think about it at a detailed level, but we're also going to consider the materiality, so the size of that budget line. So obviously if you've got a very large budget line, you want to make sure and you give it some consideration. But if you've got a stationary budget of 100 quid, it's not going to have a huge impact on your budget. So don't get bogged down in, you know, how many pens you might be planning to buy in July. It's the sort of consideration of where you need to be and the right level of making sure you've thought about it appropriately. Okay, so then expenditure first, as we said. So generally I like to start with sort of what might be the slightly easier element, which is the fixed cost, so your indirect costs, your overheads, costs that are unlikely element to them. So things like staff costs, obviously make sure you consider pay rises, salary reviews, etc., but they are generally easier to work with. Things like phone bill, things that happen on a regular basis. You know, if you have monthly annual contracts in place, you're then in a lot easier place to budget for them because you know the cost element of those things. As it says there, some costs will be known. You might have an insurance renewal. You might have some subscriptions that you can already get the price for. You might be locked into some contract prices. So those things generally fairly easy to deal with. Others can have an appropriate percentage uplift applied. So you might have some historic data that you want to use. You might want to use what's currently happening with Bank of England. So I checked this morning. The target's 2%. We're currently sitting at 3.8%. So you might want to use that as a basis for where you're thinking about what sort of percentage uplift you might be applying to those other lines as well. And then you've got your more variable costs, your reactive costs, things that are harder to predict, things like maintenance. You know, if somebody phones up and says, this is broken and you need to fix it, there is the cost element to that, but it's harder to predict when those things might happen. Things like trees as well. You know, tree falls down, we've got to go and deal with it. That's another cost. So these things may have an element of a sort of a more known cost. So maintenance might have a level of maintenance that you do all the time. Or if it's tree works, you might have some planned tree works. But if there's an element of reactiveness there where, you know, people ring in and say this needs to be resolved or something's seen and then you have to respond to it, you need to factor that in. So there's obviously going to be some considerations around if it's to do with your assets, you know, how old are they? What condition are they in? You know, how much maintenance are they likely to need if they're getting to the end of their useful life? Is there plans in place for replacing them as well? So think about that. And as we talked about building up those notes, factor in the things that you've considered as part of that budget line as well in there. You may also have some costs that are related to income as well. So they may change. So if you have, say, for example, the village hall and you're hoping you've revamped it and you're hoping to hire it out more in the next financial year, have you considered the other side of that? So if you have more income, is there an increase in costs? You know, are you going to have to pay the caretaker more to lock it up? Is there going to be increased costs of cleaning? Are utilities going to go up if it's in use more? So think about costs with relationships as well. So think about how changing that might impact on something else. And like we talked about, if you're replacing assets, then think about the maintenance of those assets. If you've got a high repair and maintenance budget, but you're actually going to replace those budget, does that have an element where it can reduce a little bit because it's a newer asset? It's not going to need so much repairs. These are generally a smaller proportion of the overall budget for a council, but obviously all important things to think about, but tend to take a little bit more consideration because there's more sort of uncertain elements within them. So once we've thought about our expenditure, we can move on to income. So we need to consider other income besides the precept because that's have an element of offsetting what we need in terms of the precept. So again, we can break it down and think about, have we got any guaranteed income or any known income? So if you have annual rent, fixed rent that you know you're going to receive, obviously that's nice and straightforward. You've got some grants coming in, you might know exactly what's going on with that. Then you've got your other slightly more variable income sources. You know, are they likely to continue? Are you increasing the rates? So if we think about that hall we just mentioned, if we have revamped it, are we thinking about that we might hire it out a little bit more? What are the rates? Are we increasing them? Other things, are they likely to continue? What might change? So make sure you consider that. And again, that relationship that we mentioned, to think about those slightly more uncertain sources, such as your venue hire, such as the cemetery. Obviously, they've got things like allotments. It's fairly standard. You know, you've got your plots, you know your rent, easier to work out. So consider those other elements that might be more variable as well. And then we need to think about our contingencies and our reserves. So this is a really important element of sort of what's happening alongside our actual budget. What other money and funds do we have? And are they appropriate and sitting as at what we need? So amounts held for unexpected expenditure or cash flow issues. So the general reserve generally advised to be equal between 3 to 12 months expenditure, depending on the size of your council. So you may have a set figure or time period that you're working to. So I've seen lots of councils where they have a very specific reserve figure that they want to maintain as their general reserve. Otherwise, it's something to consider where you want to be. So if you're smaller, you'll hold more because obviously that would be less generally sort of overall. If you're larger, you'll be closer to the 3 months figure. So that's something that you need to consider as part of this, and is useful when you're forecasting, to think about your general reserve and what that might look like at the end of the financial year. Because if you're going to have a significant variance to where you need to be, either a surplus or a deficit, we need to think about how are we going to resolve that. If you've got a big surplus, potentially we can think about offsetting the precept, but that has its own sort of caveats, thought process that we'll talk about in a little while. If you've got a deficit, how are we going to deal with that? Because we don't want to be sitting with an inadequate general reserve, because if something does happen, that's going to be a real issue. It could be a real problem if we don't have the funds to cover something that's unexpected. The other thing just to mention as well with regards to sort of unexpected spending contingencies, firstly, don't build contingencies into each budget line, because you're just going to overinflate the budget. It's when we used to work before here, we used to call it fat. Don't put fat into the budget. And lots of people do, because they get worried about overspending and they think, well, I'll just put a bit in. Something might happen, that'll cover it. But all you're doing is putting extra in that you might unlikely to need. So it's increasing the budget and therefore increasing the precept, but it's also hiding what's really going on. Because if you've put fat into the budget and then you underspend, oh, this is good, lovely, but actually you're just kind of sort of marring what's going on with it. So avoid against that if you can. And also beware of one-off costs when reviewing the actual spend. So as we talked about, obviously, if you've got a budget line where something's gone into it this year, won't be repeated, was one-off, unexpected, caused the budget to be overspent, when we're reviewing it for next year, we obviously don't need to increase the budget accordingly if that's not going to be repeated. So do be aware of that. And that comes back to what I was talking about with regards to keeping notes. If you keep notes about things like that, aid memoirs, when you get to this point, say, oh yes, we spent that, we don't need to repeat it. That's not going to be an issue for something we need to think about for next year. Okay, so thinking about our earmarked reserves and our projects. So the first one is really, really key. And if you're not doing this already, I would strongly suggest that you do, which is you use reserves to flatline the budget. So things that have a repeating element, but that aren't annual, I would suggest you have a reserve for. So things are like election costs and renewing your assets. So if every 5 years we're going to renew our asset and it's going to cost £5,000, if we put £1,000 away every year, after 5 years, we'll have 5,000. We'll renew assets. We'll build up the £5,000 a year again. 5 years' time, we'll have 5,000, and off we go again. Same with elections. We build the money up, we spend it. So rather than coming to a point of suddenly saying, right, next year we've got an election, we've got to replace these assets, we suddenly need 10k. You've got that reserve in the money in the pot to deal with it. So then it's keeping it even. Don't want to have that fluctuating budget that then causes a fluctuating precept request. So think about things that happen on a regular basis, but not annually, that you might want to put money aside for, such as that, to help you deal with those peaks and troughs. And then you've got your other sort of project reserves, your one-off reserves for things that you want to do to improve your parish or area. So this is like a mini budget. So this is like zero-based budgeting that we talked about. We're thinking about income. How are we going to fund the project? Are we getting a grant? Are we going to put some money aside for a few years to save up for it? Do we have a surplus that we now want to use for it? Think about impact on future income generation. Depending on what that project is. If it's revamping the hall, have we considered about what that might then do in the future in terms of income? Obviously, it might not have any income generation. If we're putting a play park in, there isn't any income there related to it. Also thinking about, obviously, expenditure. How much is it going to cost to do that work? So there's the direct cost of actually the construction, if it's a play park, preparing the ground, buying the items, putting them in, etc. But also the ongoing costs. We've got play park inspections now, we've got on maintenance. Do we want to have an asset renewal budget for that? So in 10 years' time, we can replace the slide or whatever it may be. Have we considered that as part of the budget as well? And as we talked about earlier, zero-based budgeting likely to be useful at this point. Okay, so quite a lot there that we've thought about. So we've talked about them as separate elements, but they all work together and we need to consider the overall picture. And then we can think about where we are with our precept calculation. So in simple terms, our precept calculation will be based on our expenditure budget. What have we worked out that we need to spend, less any other income that we're generating. So if we're receiving income and other sources, we can offset that. And we also need to think about that general reserve position, prior surplus, possible deficit. Do we want to use some of that money again to offset the precept? So then that will leave us with our precept calculation. So in a simple example there in the middle, we've got an expenditure budget of 100k. We've got other income, 20k. We therefore need a precept of 80k to balance that up to get to where we want to be. So we want to do that calculation to see where we might end up. And it's very likely, very natural that you might repeat this process. You might need to work with the budget, see what this looks like, go back, if it's not a number that works, do we need to think about what we've done? Have we been overzealous with some of our projects, whatever it may be? Also important to check the calculation based on our bandy equivalent properties. So your precepting authority should provide that information, how many equivalent bandy properties you have, and you'll divide the precept that you're going to set across those properties, and then the comparison with last year will give you a feel for that, particularly if the number of bandy properties that you have has changed considerably, because actually the precept might change a lot, but the actual impact to an actual individual property might not be so great. So that's an also important calculation to see how that might work out as well. So obviously once you've done that process and you've got a number, we need to think about it. So I've got there, what if the precept amount is vastly different to last year? But regardless of how it comes out, the first point there, please, please, please check your calculations. Particularly if you're using a spreadsheet and you've got a formula that's not picked something up, that's going to cause you a problem. And we do see that reasonably regularly when councillors come from spreadsheets to Scribe and they ask us to put the numbers in as part of the setup process. And we put the numbers in, and actually what we then get out isn't the budget figure that they thought they had because they've missed out a line in the formula. So please, please, please check it's all in there. Nothing's been double counted and everything is in there. Particularly obviously got weird numbers coming out. It might simply be a formula issue. So different an issue. Do we need to revisit the budget? Firstly, have we been too generous? Have we put too much fat in? Have we got to think about more cost savings? Have we got some projects that we actually might need to defer? Obviously, that's not an ideal solution to an issue because that actually impacts your parishioners if they can't have some of the things that you were hoping to plan for. Can the precept required be reduced? So have we got a surplus that we haven't considered? Are we thinking about building that into it? As we mentioned, we have to be careful about that because if we have got a general reserve surplus and we go, oh, great, we can offset the precept. And I've actually seen sometimes people put the precept down as a result of that. What happens next year? If we use all that up and we go, oh, I haven't got enough now, we need to go back up again, that precept is going to be going up and down. And how do people feel about that? The actual people who are paying that precept, do they expect it to go down? Sort of peaks and troughs. So managing it. And another thing, actually, I will mention as well is how many times I've heard people say to me that their councillors want to keep the precept the same. They don't want to put it up. They see that as a really good thing. We've not changed the precept as it was last year, but costs are rising. If we don't take more precept, the services that the council is providing are going up. So it's actually causing us a problem. We're going to end up in a deficit position. So in 3-5 years' time, we haven't put the precept up. Suddenly we need to go up 20%. How does that look? Is it better just to keep a small increment to keep us where we need to be? So do think about all those things, and hopefully councillors as well are thinking about that, particularly if they are really sort of adamant they don't want to do that kind of thing. And then the bottom one there, or is the change justifiable and needed? How is it that there was an issue with the budget previously, or is it that you're now taking on more services, or you're now responsible for more assets, going back to thinking about government reorganisations, devolution? Do we need to change things? Depending on what you're taking responsibility for and whether you're getting any funding or not, have you got to build that, and therefore the precept's going up? So that's obviously important. If you do find that the precept's increasing by more than what you might feel is in a sort of general amount, sort of 5% wise, obviously communication is key. Tell people what the plan is, what why it's going up, what's part of that process. Again, I did this session a couple of years ago and had a guy on there who said that their precept had gone up because they've had real issues with traffic in the village, and the residents really wanted the speed indicator signs. So they'd put the precept up so that they could plan for this project to have that in because it was so important. And actually, rather than being a backlash about the precept going up, everybody really wanted it. So it doesn't have to necessarily be that the precept going up is bad if it's going to provide things that people really, really want. So these are all the things to think about when we get to this point and seeing what the numbers are looking like. So very brief one there, obviously cost of living. This is again something we put in when Liz Truss was in place. I think I did 2 budgeting sessions, and the first one she was there and the second one she wasn't. So we obviously had some cost increases, but just to think about how we might be able to save some money if we do want to look at that for our budget. So reducing energy. So thinking about, automatic lighting that's not on all the time, the way the heating, is it planned out. Can we reduce office waste? If we're printing out a huge pack every time we have a council meeting, can we do it online? There's that deferred projects plan spending again, not my favourite because, as we said, impacts on things. Can we review our contracts and our suppliers? Can we get some fixed price deals? Particularly nice just to know where we're going to be with our budget for next year. Can we invest in technology? If you've got an accountant that does some of this or your year end, etc., could you get software and actually you do it in-house and let them save some money? So things to think about as part of that process. Now, to finish off, because I'm conscious I've been talking for a very long time, just to finish off is about monitoring the budget and looking ahead. So right at the start, we talked about how important it is to think about the budget all the year through, not just now because we need to set a precept, but actually monitoring that budget versus actuals helps us with the overspend, analysing what's going on and actually understanding it then helps us at this time of the year as well. We need a good cash book. Obviously you need to know what's going on. You need to be able to review your budget versus actuals. And quite often we see cash books, lovely budget, perfectly structured, nice budget lines, but the cash book bears no resemblance to that budget. So actually trying to see the actual spend against it, really, really hard. So make sure you've got something in place that allows you to analyse that. The notes, as I keep mentioning, please keep notes. If things are changing considerably or things have happened, keep notes because then you can refer to that. So yes, we did that because of this, this and this. This is where we agreed it. That's then resolved. And then all those, so as we said, future reference, future queries, we've got notes. We know where we agreed those items. Little extract there of just a simple report on Scribe that gives us our budget versus actual. So just thinking about structuring it in a way that we can analyse exactly what's going on. So making that work well. And then just the last thing then is just looking ahead. So it might be useful as well to consider a 3 to 5 year budget forecast at a summary level, obviously not at the detail that we're talking about for next year, but looking ahead. It helps to consider the impact on future years and assists with informed decision making. It might be more relevant for larger councils, but also if the scope is expected to change. So development in your area or service level. So again, if we go back to thinking about you taking on more services, more assets, how might that play out? Where might that lead us? So just to give us a bit of a feel of what that might look. And it can literally be at sort of income expenditure kind of levels in sort of summary level, just to give us a feel of what might be happening. Okay, I've made it. I'm there. Let me stop sharing and hand